All right, our stream and recording are going. Ezekiel chapter 40. Oh, it's been a week. Not a good week either, just been a week.
Well, at least somebody's eye's getting better.
Yeah.
Amen.
So as we've been going through Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39 we were looking at, describes the last great battle before the millennium. Talks about Gog and Magog. And as we talked about, a lot of people have gone out and tried to make out Gog to be a specific person, a specific leader. The only thing we can say that Gog is the Antichrist. Based on what we see, based on everything that's there. And the really cool thing as you look at this is that God initiates the entirety of that whole deal, where in the middle of the tribulation period, Israel is his peace pact is broken, and all the different things that come against Israel during the time then of the last half of the tribulation period. Chapter 38 describes in some interesting detail that God orchestrates everything, and God brings about the pestilence and the hailstones. And remember, Revelation talks about hailstones that are as big as a basketball. Alliteration is made to the same thing here in Ezekiel. So Ezekiel and Revelation are talking about much the similar things there when you see in Revelation the last half of the tribulation, and you see the battle of Gog and Magog. And remember, Gog is just the name of the leader. The leader's name is Gog. Magog means horde of Gog or group of Gog. So Magog are the people, not the person. So now we get done with chapter 39, and in chapter 39 we saw that the battle is going to be so, or let me back up. The army is going to be so large that comes in to the land of Israel that their weapons will be used as fire for the Israelites for 7 years. The burial will take 7 months of the dead. And the Israelites, while they don't have a piece or a part in the battle, because you remember what Revelation tells us, that the Antichrist and his minions will come after Israel, and God will protect them in a desert place. So they're protected by God. They have nothing to do during the battle. God is the one that smites them. In chapter 39, God says, "And I will bring you down." In other words, he doesn't say, "and Israel will conquer you." He says, I will bring you down. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to do away with you. I'm going to finish you off. I'm going to be the one so that the entirety of the world knows that I am God. And essentially, as we got to the end of chapter 39, that's exactly what God is reminding the people, that he is no longer going to hide his face from the people of Israel. That the people of Israel have been restored. They've been brought back from the lands of their enemies. And God says in chapter 39, verse 27, "Then I shall be sanctified through them." God will be set apart, made holy through them in the sight of many nations. And that's how we know that this is not talking about the battle at the end of the millennium, but this is talking about the battle before the millennium, because many nations will still exist during the time of the millennial reign. So God is giving the people of Israel a picture of what this is going to look like, what the time of Jacob's trouble, how that's going to end, how that's going to finish up. And so at the end of chapter 39, he says, "I will not hide my face from them any longer, for I will have poured out my spirit on the house of Israel." And remember that when he talks about pouring out his spirit, that's a salvation spirit message. Okay? This is when Israel accepts Jesus, when they understand who Jesus is fully. They've turned to Jesus. They understand him. They know him. Now, as we're going to see as we go through chapter 40 today, and we'll see if we get all the way through it. We probably will, because there's a lot of measurements here. We don't need to dwell on a lot of it. But as we go through chapter 40, we're going to see that in the millennium, there is a temple. In the millennium, there is a time of sacrifices. And we're going to talk about why are there still sacrifices in the millennium if Christ has returned. If Christ is on the throne, why is there a temple in Jerusalem? Why are there still sacrifices? Okay? And when you realize how Scripture phrases things, and what Scripture says about these things, it's a valid reason for that. And I'll get there when I get there. But it's a neat thing to think about when we get to that point. All right? We might have some discussion on it, we might not. You guys might all go, okay, cool. If you ask questions, that's fine too. But chapters 40 and 41 and 42 are going to deal with the temple. Now the temple we're going to be looking at is the third temple. If you recall, there have already been 2 temples, official temples, that were created. What were those 2 temples? Anybody remember before we pray?
Herod's temple?
Herod's temple. That was the second one. What was the first one? Oh, come on, this is easy. Who built the temple?
Solomon.
Thank you.
So I was just looking over it this morning.
Now you might think to yourself, wait a minute, there were technically 3 temples already. Well, no, the temple that was built in the time of Ezra was not a new temple, it was a rebuilding of Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple was one. Herod's temple was a redesign. It was designed differently than Solomon's. It was a different size. This temple is a different size and different shape again. It's a redesign. It's not the same. So it is the third temple. And it exists during the millennium. So we're going to get into chapters 40 here, at least today. Next week, again, 41 and 42, they are very small chapters. Good, Art?
I have a question. If this is a temple that exists during the millennium, then what about the one that the Antichrist moves into and declares? Will that not be the third one?
I don't know that that's considered the third temple because it's not a true temple.
And I had that discussion with Tim the other day when we happened to stop by to water flowers, that I said, so the last temple coming down from heaven will be the fourth? He said, not necessarily. There could be many more temples. We just don't know how many.
Yeah. I mean, it is a temple. It's not one that was ordained by God.
The Antichrist sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God, and he desecrates that temple. So and that temple's not built yet, so
Nope.
that would be the third in my mind.
Well, it could be a rebuilding of the second,
Yeah.
which is where most of the scholars go, that is strictly just like...
So they take the same Nehemiah, Ezra one,
Yeah.
and rebuild that same one.
Yes.
But there's walls of it, I guess, footers of it.
Well, it would be a rebuilding of Herod's temple.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be a rebuilding of Ezra's.
Yeah.
Because Ezra rebuilt the first temple.
Yeah.
The Antichrist will rebuild the second temple more than likely. So it's not the third temple because there's a difference here in this temple.
Okay.
Good question. All right. Anything else before we open up with a word of prayer? Okay. Let's open up with prayer. Lord Heavenly Father, I come to you this morning and I thank you so much for your word. I thank you for these people who are here to look at your word, Lord, and to study it. I pray now that we would open our hearts and minds to you today, that you can use your word to change us, Lord, to make us the people you desire us to be. Lord, may we look at these and not just see numbers and things that don't mean anything to us, Lord, but may we see the grandeur, Lord. May we see your plan and your heart in all of this. May we see your desires in all of this, Lord. Help us now to just let you work in us as you worked in Ezekiel and in the hearts of the people around him at those days. May we open our hearts to you, Lord. May I open my mind to you, that I would say the things you desire me to say, Lord. And most importantly, all that's done and said today may be honoring and glorifying to you. For your name we pray. Amen. So chapter 40 now, we have a vision of a man with a measuring rod. So chapter 40, let's look at the first 4 verses here. In the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th of the month, in the 14th year after the city was taken, on that same day the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me there. In the visions of God, he brought me into the land of Israel, and set me on a very high mountain. And on it to the south there was a structure like a city. So he brought me there, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of bronze, with a line of flax and a measuring rod in his hand, and he was standing in the gateway. Then he said to me, Son of man, see with your eyes, hear with your ears, and give attention to all that I am going to show you, for you have been brought here in order to show it to you. Declare to the house of Israel all that you see. So now there's a lot of detail given here as far as when this occurs. It's the 25th year of the exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th of the month, It's the 14th year after the city was taken. So they were in captivity for how long before Jerusalem was captured?
Wasn't it 70 years?
7, a little more than that. 11 years.
Okay.
So because they were in captivity for 25 at this point. And the city was taken 14 years before this point. So they had 11 years of captivity before the city was captured by Babylon. Now, what is the date? Well, again, people with more free time on their hands than I have gone through and calculated this out to be 573 BC. Now, Ezekiel tells us here that it's the beginning of the year. Right, so January. No. January is the beginning of our year. Beginning of the Israelite year was Nisan. And interestingly enough, it was on the 10th of the month. Now, what occurred in the month of Nisan? Passover. Interestingly enough, the 10th of the month was the start of the preparations for Passover. So here is Ezekiel. I would imagine he's preparing for Passover in whatever capacity they had it in Babylon, for those who were willing to do it, which probably were not a whole lot of them, unless they wanted to make it look good. And so here he is, he's there, getting himself ready, and, well, the date that the lamb was to be selected for Passover, according to Exodus 12:3, God appears to him. And he brings him into a vision. So here's the important thing to note here, that this is all dealing with Passover. Now, why is that important? Well, because all of this deals with the time after the one who died that Passover was pointing to, the one who died, comes back to Israel, sets foot on the Mount of Olives. According to Zechariah, what happens to the mountain?
Flatlands.
Splits in two. And the geology of the area completely has already changed because of the tribulation, but changes even more. When the mountain splits, there's a large flat area. So all this has occurred. And here, is there symbology with the timing here? Absolutely. Absolutely. Ezekiel is preparing for the Passover, and it's the Passover lamb that will be sitting in the Holy of Holies in the third temple, reigning from Jerusalem. So here, he's brought into God's vision. And one of the ways we know that he is not seeing heaven is a very simple phrase here. He's not seeing the temple that's in heaven, that very last temple that's created. We know that for a very important reason, because we are told here he was brought into Israel. Ezekiel himself says, I'm in the land of Israel. Interestingly enough, he doesn't identify where he's at as being Jerusalem. Now, why do you think that is? Well, because of the topology changing, nothing looks the same to him. All he knows is that he's in Israel. He doesn't know for sure exactly where he is. He can assume it's Jerusalem, but he doesn't mention that because he doesn't know for sure. So there he is in this vision. And by the way, the entirety of the last part of Ezekiel is a vision that God gave to Ezekiel here. And here he is in the land of Israel to a very high mountain. The mountain is not named. What mountain could it be? I could speculate from now until Sunday. Well, it is Sunday, but I can speculate from now until next Sunday. And never come up with a firm guess. Some theologians say it's Mount Zion. Other theologians say it's other mountains. I'm not even gonna say what it is because I don't know. But it's a very high mountain. Now, interestingly enough, Revelation talks to us, and as well as Zechariah talks to us about the fact that the landscape of Israel will change completely. The Mount of Olives will split, other mountains are raised up, everything changes, which again is why Ezekiel doesn't recognize what he's seeing. So here's these very high mountains, and he looks and he sees a structure that's like a city. He looks out and he sees something that is different. It stands out in the landscape. It's not something that's normal. It's something that looks really different and really interesting. And what I think is really neat here is that he goes through all of this, noticing all of these different things first before he notices the man. He sees the land, he sees the mountain, he sees that there's a structure like a city, and God brings him there. And the next thing he says is, wait a minute, there's a man here. There's a guy here whose appearance is like the appearance of bronze. Now, who is this person? Any thoughts?
Jesus. That's what I was going to say too. But we're wrong, I can tell.
We can't say with any assurance that it's Jesus. All right. Based on the appearance, it could be. Based on the fact that in chapter 44, verses 2 and 5, he's called Lord, it's a good possibility. From what we see here right now in this passage, though, we don't know for sure. All we know is this is some sort of an angelic being. And keep in mind that Jesus was a spirit being before coming down to the earth. So, in Ezekiel's time frame, this is more than likely is Jesus. I can't say for sure it is. Now, this person here, and keep in mind that in Revelation we also see the temple being measured. Who's measuring the temple in Revelation? Anybody remember? It was an angel doing the measuring in Revelation. But here this man is there, and he's got with him, he's got the appearance of bronze. In other words, he's glowing, he's shining. Now, have you ever seen pure bronze? I'm not talking about the stuff we get today, which is really not as good as it used to be, but I'm talking pure bronze. Really pure bronze glows. When you get any kind of light on it, it's just brilliant. The only thing better is really pure gold when it's done right. The temple in Solomon's day was all lined with gold on the inside of the buildings and the courtyards, and they had windows around the top. And what would happen is you'd have sunlight come in, it would hit the gold, and it would reflect all over the gold, and everything would just glow. You'd have this golden glow coming from the building. When God's presence was in the Holy of Holies, the light of his presence would illuminate everything and would make everything shine as well. So here's this person that's obviously a being that is not a human being, that's in the form of a man. He's bright, he's gleaming, and he speaks English. Well, he speaks whatever language that Ezekiel can understand. Speaks Hebrew, speaks Babylonian. But the man here says to Ezekiel, and one of the reasons that I believe that this very well could be Jesus is because he says the same thing that God says to him. The man said to me, Son of man. Gee, isn't that what God's been calling Ezekiel this entire time? Wouldn't it stand to reason that Jesus would call him Son of Man as well? This is Son of Man, and I love his declaration here. Because here's this guy standing with a measuring rod and a line of flax. Now, the line of flax was used for longer measurements. All right, it's like a tape measure almost. The measuring rod was used for shorter measurements. Now, the purpose for measuring something is what? What's that, Betty?
See how big it is or long?
No, that's not.
Accuracy.
What's that?
Accuracy.
Accuracy is one, but the overall biggest reason that you would measure something?
Make sure it fits.
What's that?
To document the size.
No,
To make sure things fit.
to claim ownership. Back in the day when you bought something, like specifically a piece of land, a house, whatever, first thing you would do is you'd measure it, document that you owned it. So here is this man measuring the temple. Why? Because God here is measuring what belongs to him. He's claiming it as his own. Zechariah also sees an angel with a measuring line in Zechariah chapters 2, verses 1 and 2. So here, this being looks at Ezekiel and says, Son of man, see with your eyes, hear with your ears, and give attention. And I like that part here. Give attention to all that I am going to show you, for you have been brought here in order to show it to you. Isn't that just really, if you're Ezekiel, aren't you just really humbled by that? First off, here's the person saying, pay close attention. Because it says, see with your eyes, hear with your ears. In other words, don't just gloss over everything. Look at it. Pay attention to it. Listen to me. Pay attention to what I am saying. And he says again, and give attention to all that I am going to show you. In other words, pay attention to it. Pay attention to it. Now, we used to have to do this with our daughter when she was growing up, because like any kid, like any of us, we only pay half attention sometimes. And so you'd have to go, you paying attention to me? All right, what did I just say? I used to have to do it with my employees at work. It's a lot of fun. So he says, here, pay attention, and then forget everything. No, pay attention, and then declare to the house of Israel all that you see. He is being told here that his job, when he's done being shown what this angel, what this being is going to show him, is to not hide it, not write it down and lock it up someplace like Daniel was told to do. Daniel was told to do that because what he had seen, Israel was not ready for. So he was told, write this down and hide it for the last days. Here, Ezekiel is being told, I want you to take special attention to everything. And not only that, but once you get all done writing everything down, then you are to tell everyone in Israel what you've seen. I mean, I love that, the picture of that, is that Ezekiel was to write it down and to proclaim it to everybody. The entirety of his message to Israel was to be proclaimed to the house of Israel. Now, the sad part was, just like Jeremiah, God told Ezekiel, nobody's going to pay any attention. But he's being told here, you are to declare it. Declare everything you see. He's already declared in chapters 1 through 24 the reason that they were removed from the land. In chapters 25 to 32, he was given the job of declaring to them the historical judgments on the other nations. In chapter 34 to 39, he's declared to them that they will literally be returned to the same land. In chapters 38 and 39, he's declaring to them the battle that's to occur. And in chapters 40 to 38, he's continuing to bring them the conditions after the Messiah comes. See, he's being told to constantly deliver to them the message that they are being told. And he's to write down every detail so nothing is lost.
So he's declaring this to the Israelites in his time. Right, okay. Because when you were talking before about the fact that he will not hide his face anymore and stuff, so that is during the beginning of the millennium.
Right.
So they should already know.
Correct.
So, okay.
Yep. This is preparation. He's telling Israel everything they need to know for what's going to happen during the
But
millennium
they
period.
still ignore it because,
Well, yeah.
right, because they're not there yet.
Because they're not there yet. So now in verse 5, he starts into the measurements. Now we're going to read through the measurements. One thing we need to remember is, how big is a cubit?
About 3, was it?
That's
18
15.
inches.
Yeah, a lot depends on who's
Not
measuring.
that big.
Is that around 18?
Some people with T-Rex arms, my wife, have
Watch
shorter
it
cubits than
now.
others. But a cubit, a general way of measuring a cubit was from your fingertip to your elbow. Now, for most people, and this is where God just does really wacky and miraculous and wonderful things. For most people, that's 18 inches. Now, I know you're dying to take a tape measure. I don't have one of those, but take a tape measure when you get home, measure from here to here, and see how long your arm is.
I think we're in trouble.
So he's going to be giving these details here about what a cubit is 18 inches. The rod was what they called 6 royal or long cubits of 21 inches. So a royal cubit was 21 inches. The rod was 6 of those. Let's see here. A breadth, when a hand breadth, when it talks about a hand breadth, that's 3 inches. Okay. So since he's using a rod and a flax, the rod is going to be based on more than likely the royal cubit of 21 inches. Okay. So now we've got those ideas. It gives you a basis here for what we're going to start seeing. So verse 5, behold, there was a wall on the outside of the temple all around, and in the man's hand was a measuring rod of 6 cubits, each of which was a cubit and a handbreadth, which is the royal cubit. So 18 inches plus 3 inches, 21 inches. So he measured the thickness of the wall, 1 rod, and the height, 1 rod. Then he went to the gate, which faced east, went up its steps, and measured the threshold of the gate, 1 rod in width, and the other threshold was 1 rod in width. All right, so I'm going to stop there for just a minute. So here he starts measuring. 6 cubits of 21 inches would be a total of 10.5 feet. Okay? So 6 of these, this rod was 6 royal cubits long, was a 10.5 foot rod. So as he's measuring these things, he's taking the measuring rod, and at 10.5 feet, he's measuring the outside wall. And the wall was, as he reads here, was 1 rod in width, and the threshold was 1 rod in width. So here's the gate. The gates are 10.5 feet tall, or 10.5 feet wide, I should say, excuse me. So as he's measuring these things, he measures the wall. The thickness of the wall is 10.5 feet. The height is 10.5 feet. The gate, which faces east, because next, after he gets done measuring the initial measurement of thickness of the walls, he starts on the gates. He goes to the gateway that's in the east, and he goes to the alcove. So verses 6 and 7 talk about that. He went to the gate which faced east, went up its steps, and measured the threshold of the gate, 1 rod in width, and the other threshold was 1 rod in width. Now, it's important that the thresholds are the same width as the wall. The guard room was 1 rod long and 1 rod wide, and there were 5 cubits between the guard rooms, and the threshold of the gate by the porch of the gate facing inward was 1 rod. So he's now going out and he's looking at it, and he starts to go from the east. Now, why did he start in the east? Well, let's get that out of the way first. He starts in the east because you always approached the temple from the east. Okay, that's what they did. That's how they approached it. Your main approach was always from the east to get to the temple. So he starts in the east. The openings are all 10.5 feet across. The chambers that are in the walls are 10.5 feet by 10.5 feet. Now he's giving us precise measurements here, and he's describing this in detail. Why? Because he wants us to know one very important thing. This is not a hypothetical building or a symbolic building. This is a literal temple that is going to be put up in the future that he is seeing. Now, before I get too much further, let me hand these out. And if somebody could come grab these and hand them out to me, I'd really appreciate it. This is the best drawing I could find of the temple as being described here by Ezekiel.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
While we're passing this thing out, the way Ezekiel is here at this time, getting these measurements and everything. Does he have a temple in existence at that time? We're here around, what's the date that you gave us?
573 BC, I think it was.
So it was 573.
Or
Does he have
537, I forget which.
Does he have a temple in existence at that time?
No. As he's getting these measurements, the temple's already been destroyed by the Babylonians and looted.
Okay.
Now, was there one before he was taken captive? Absolutely, there was one in Jerusalem. But when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem 11 years before, or 14 years before this, they destroyed the temple.
I just figured if he had a temple in existence, or if he had visited the temple, he'd have a little bit more in his mind of that he could envision what he was getting measured.
I'm sure he's been in the temple because he was a priest in Jerusalem.
Right.
Matter of fact, everything he's describing here would have been things he would very well understand and know because he had been in the temple.
Right.
Not being the high priest, there was only one place he couldn't go. That was the Holy of Holies. Since he was a priest, he could go everywhere else in the temple complex. So he was familiar with Solomon's temple.
Perhaps the book.
Yeah, go ahead.
I might have missed this, but in the Son of Man, in verse 4, that's referring to Ezekiel, not to Jesus.
Right. Yep. God uses that term for Ezekiel through the entirety of the book of Ezekiel.
Okay, but in the New Testament, it refers to Jesus.
Jesus takes on that title, yep. Exactly. All good questions. Any other questions? I mean, this is where we get into the dry part of this, okay? All the measurements. That's why I gave you the handouts here. These give you a general idea. I mean, you can see the outer wall there. That's 10.5 feet tall. Look at the size of the gates. How much taller they are than the outside, the rest of the wall. We're going to get into some of those here in a couple minutes, but the only thing I don't like that they did here is they put the river of life running through the center of the temple. That's yeah.
It's like the other temple.
Yeah. So that's the one thing I don't like, but the actual squareness of it and the generality of the measurements here are pretty much all on how they have it drawn. So ignore the river of life because that's not in this temple. Ezekiel is seeing. So now he goes to the gate and the alcove. He goes to the guard room. He measures all these different things. The gate complex here, when he talks about an alcove, the gate complex here has side rooms that face an open hallway. There have been different excavations done of Iron Age gates from Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer, all in Israel. And it matches the layout of what we see in other gates. So this is a standard gate that would have been made. Okay? There's nothing unique or different about these gates. It's just that we are given precise and specific measurements for these gates. Keeping in mind that the chambers, the rooms in the wall here are 10.5 feet by 10.5 feet. Well, I want you to notice that the majority of things that we're going to see here are all square. The entirety of the temple is a square temple. Which, when we get to it, and I'll go through this again next week, when we get to it, it works out to be roughly 1 square mile. When everything is all measured out. Again, we'll cover that next week when we go towards the end of the chapters. So he sees the east gate. He sees the guard room that's there. He sees the rooms that are there. He sees 5 cubits between each guard room. He sees the threshold of the gate by the porch of the gate that faced inward was 1 rod. So even that threshold was 10.5 feet wide. Verses 8 through 16, he starts talking about some of the chambers that are there. We read that he measured the porch of the gate facing inward 1 rod. He measured the porch of the gate 8 cubits and its side pillars 2 cubits. This is where you get the the sides of the gates being taller than the wall, because the wall is how many cubits? It's 1 rod long, right? So these are 2 long. Let's see here. So the porch gate 8 cubits, the side pillars 2 cubits. The porch of the gate was faced inward. The guard rooms of the gate toward the east numbered 3 on each side. The 3 of them had the same measurement. The side pillars also had the same measurement on each side. And he measured the width of the gateway 10 cubits and the length of the gate 13 cubits. There was a barrier wall 1 cubit wide in front of the guard rooms on each side. And the guard rooms were 6 cubits square on each side. He measured the gate from the roof of the one guard room to the roof of the other, a width of 25 cubits from one door to the door opposite. He made the side pillars 60 cubits high. Here's your height. And the gate extended round about to the side pillar of the courtyard. From the front of the entrance gate to the front of the inner porch of the gate was 50 cubits. There were shuttered windows looking toward the guard rooms and toward their side pillars within the gate all around, and likewise for the porches, and there were windows all around inside, and on each side pillar were palm tree ornaments. So he's looking at these rooms and at the gate. He sees that the gate, the pillars are 2 cubits wide, which makes them, depending if you're using the royal cubit or the standard cubit, if it's standard cubit, they're 36 inches wide pillars. If you're using the royal cubit, it's 42 inches. Right? These pillars were humongous. I mean, they're wider than our tables here. That's how wide the pillars were. I mean, you couldn't hug one. They're, how tall did he say? Did you catch that? How tall he said they are?
Hold on, I'm getting there. Was that 60?
60 cubits high. So we're not talking tiny little pillars here. We're talking humongous pillars. That's why I like the way this draws out these gates, because the gates were extremely tall. Yet the wall was only 10.5 feet tall. Now, this is different, isn't it? I mean, if you think of a gate and a wall, your gate is at least the same height as your wall normally, right? Because what is the idea behind a gate and a wall around a city?
Protection.
Protection. This is not for protection. This wall is not there to protect anybody. These gates are not there to protect anybody. The whole purpose of this, besides my wife to spill her coffee over the table, the whole purpose of this is not protection, but to keep the holy and the unholy separated. And we're going to get into that when we get a little farther on as well. So he measures these chambers. He sees beveled window frames. Now, they didn't have glass back then. Right? Glass didn't come in until the Roman era. You didn't have glass in your windows typically. So they would have had lattice work, shutters or lattice work things covering the openings of each one. On each of the gates, the gate posts, they see palm trees. They have palm trees on each of them. Now, what is the purpose of having a palm tree showing on these? Any thoughts?
Well, you have Palm Sunday.
Well, yeah, that's not the actual purpose,
I'm
but
getting there.
Solomon's temple have palm trees?
it did, yeah.
Okay.
Solomon's temple had palms as well. They were symbolic, and most people don't realize this, but the palms were there because they were symbolic of God's desire for Israel to bear fruit. They are symbols of beauty. And I didn't realize this. They are symbols of beauty, salvation, and triumph. I didn't realize that the palm, besides Palm Sunday, I didn't realize that palms are symbols of beauty. And they're symbols of salvation. So he's got palm trees on these gate posts. Palms are also on the inner court's gate posts as well. In 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 32, we see that the doorways of the first temple were also decorated with palm trees. So it's a motif here that God has continued on with. Next, in verses 17 to 37, he gets a look at the inner and the outer courts. Now keep in mind, he has not gone any farther than the entranceway at this point. So verse 17, he starts off with, "Then he brought me into the outer court. And behold, there were chambers and a pavement made for the court all around. 30 chambers faced the pavement. The pavement, that is the lower pavement, was by the side of the gates, corresponding to the length of the gates. Then he measured the width from the front of the lower gate to the front of the exterior of the inner court, 100 cubits on the east and on the north. As for the gate of the outer court which faced the north, he measured its length and its width. It had 3 guard rooms on each side, and its side pillars and its porches had the same measurement as the first gate. Its length was 50 cubits and the width 25 cubits. Its windows and its porches and all its palm tree ornaments had the same measurements as the gate which faced towards the east, and it was reached by 7 steps, and its porch was in front of them. The inner court had a gate opposite the gate on the north as well as the gate on the east, and he measured 100 cubits from gate to gate. Then he led me toward the south, and behold, there was a gate toward the south, and he measured its side pillars and its porches according to those same measurements. The gate and its porches had windows all around like those other windows. The length was 50 cubits and the width 25 cubits. There were 7 steps going up to it, and its porches were in front of them. And it had palm tree ornaments on its side pillars, one on each side. The inner court had a gate toward the south, and he measured from gate to gate toward the south 100 cubits. So we'll stop there for a minute. So here he is getting all the measurements here of the outer court. Now remember, the temple was essentially 3 main areas. You had the wall surrounding the entirety of the temple, which led you into the outer court. Now, in Jesus' time, there was also a Gentile court, where the Gentiles could go in, but they could go no farther, which was also the outer court. Then you had an inner court. The inner court here, as you see on the pictures, as we're going to see here in a couple minutes, has gates as well. And then the third area was the actual Holy of Holies, or the temple itself. Every one of these, and what's interesting here is as you see this, every one of these has a different elevation. The outer court, you had to go up 7 steps to get into the gate, to get into the court. Now there's a reason for that. The elevation of the interior of the complex increases to accompany the increased level of holiness. Every time you went up a level, you were on a different level of holiness. So the outer court was one level. The inner court was another level, was separate. That's why you could only go into the inner court if you were a Jew in the original temple. And then the Holy of Holies of the temple itself was on a 3rd level. And again, that was a higher level because that was where God lived, quote unquote. That was where God had his residence when he was in Jerusalem. So that's why you see all these different heights being measured here. I want you to take notice that the court here and the measurements here, you're going to see some very common numbers. You're going to see 5, 25, 50, and 100 cubits being frequently used. The sanctuary itself formed a square of some 500 cubits. So if you do 500 times 21 inches, you get to be roughly a mile. Because a mile is how many feet?
5,280.
Yep. So everything when it's all measured out is roughly 1 mile square.
So in regular language, this should be about 640 acres.
Yeah, probably. That's about right. If my math is
Maybe
very
someone
correct.
can relate to that with their size of their property or this property.
Right.
But 640 acres is a pretty big chunk of ground.
It really is, yeah.
It's not low.
Yep. It is not a small piece of property. So here
There's a football
you've got-
field on there too.
Yeah,
For reference,
yeah.
most people know what size that is.
So here you've got all these different measurements. You've got this blueprint being laid out of how this is designed, this is built, this is set up. I want you to notice that all of the gates are identical. Yet he gives us the measurements just to make sure that we understand that they're identical. He tells you it's identical, but here's the measurements anyway. We have the elevations that go up. A lot of people have gone to great lengths to say that there are 7 steps because 7 is the number of God. I don't know why there's 7 steps, but interestingly enough, the inner courtyard, as we start reading in verse 28, is separated by 8 steps, not 7. So let's continue reading on here from 27 on. The inner court had a gate toward the south, and he measured from gate to gate toward the south 100 cubits. So you see that the number of 100 is still ringing true here, 100 cubits. Then he brought me to the inner court by the south gate, and he measured the south gate according to those same measurements. Its guardrooms also, its side pillars and its porches were according to those same measurements. And the gate and its porches had windows all around. It was 50 cubits long and 25 cubits wide. There were porches all around, 25 cubits long and 5 cubits wide. Its porches were toward the outer court, and palm tree ornaments were on its side pillars, and its stairway had 8 steps. He brought me into the inner court toward the east, and he measured the gate according to those same measurements. Its guardrooms also, its side pillars, and its porches were according to those same measurements. And the gate and its porches had windows all around. It was 50 cubits long and 25 cubits wide. Its porches were toward the outer court, and palm tree ornaments were on its side pillars on each side, and its stairway had 8 steps. Then he brought me to the north gate, and he measured it according to those same measurements, with its guardrooms, its side pillars, its porches, and the gate had windows all around. The length was 50 cubits, and the width 25 cubits. Its side pillars were toward the outer court, and palm tree ornaments were on its side pillars on each side, and its stairway had 8 steps. Okay, now what's that all saying? Well, basically, these gates in the inner court are the same exact size as the gates on the to get into the temple complex. The gates don't change. They're identical. The distances between gates are all the same for every single gate. The difference being here is that there are now 8 steps to get up into the inner court. So you've got all these things of the same measurement. You've got this court that's elevated. You've got everything else that's going on here. Now, we don't really know what the inner wall looked like. We just know what the outer wall looked like. We don't really have a lot of detail here. Why don't we have a lot of detail? Because it's not important. Matter of fact, one thing we're going to see, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the questions that I have after looking through this is, it gives you a lot of description of the temple, but what does it mean to us?
That's a good question.
Because it's like, okay, so they're going to have a big complex with the temple in the center, and the whole thing's called a temple.
Mm-hmm.
But what does it really mean to us?
That brings us to our next section in the chapter.
Okay.
Because to us, to believers, not much.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I mean, there's a lot of description,
Uh-huh.
but I don't know what it really
Who's
means.
Ezekiel talking to?
Israel.
Israel.
Yeah, to the Jews.
Who's this important to then?
Jews.
Israel. It's not important to us. And I'm going to get into that here. That brings us, it's a very good question, and I did not prompt that. But it's a very good question because it brings us into the next step in verses 38 to 47, when we see some of the chambers that are here, specifically in verse 38. A chamber with its doorway was by the side pillars at the gates. There they rinse the burnt offering. In fact, let's read through this, and then we're going to talk about this a bit. In the porch of the gate were 2 tables on each side on which to slaughter the burnt offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. On the outer side, as one went up the gateway toward the north, were 2 tables, and on the other side of the porch of the gate were 2 tables. 4 tables were on each side next to the gate, or 8 tables on which they slaughter sacrifices. For the burnt offering, there were 4 tables of hewn stone, 1.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1 cubit high, on which they lay the instruments with which they slaughter the burnt offering and the sacrifice. The double hooks, 1 handbreadth in length, were installed in the house all around, and on the tables was the flesh of the offering. From the outside to the inner gate were chambers for the singers in the inner court, one of which was at the side of the north gate, with its front toward the south, and one at the side of the south gate facing the north. He said to me, "This is the chamber which faces toward the north, toward the south, intended for the priests who keep charge of the temple. But the chamber which faces toward the north is for the priests who keep charge of the altar. These are the sons of Zadok, who from the sons of Levi come near to the Lord to minister here." He measured the court, a perfect square, 100 cubits long and 100 cubits wide, and the altar was in front of the temple. Stop there for a minute. All right, I want you to catch something here. That this temple is laid out specifically here as you get towards the inner court for what?
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice. Now, a lot of people here stop and go, wait a minute here. Why? Why are sacrifices still existing in the millennial kingdom? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think he asked us that last week.
Uh-huh.
What was that again?
He asked us that last week.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody had an answer over here, right?
No.
No, I wouldn't do it.
Shut up.
The sacrifices during the millennium are no more efficient, no more, the word is efficacious. They mean no more in the millennium than they did in the Old Testament.
It's like communion. Is it simply symbolism?
What's that?
Symbolic.
Symbolic, like communion. What was the purpose of the Old Testament offerings?
To forgive their sin.
Nope. There was no offering that could forgive them of their sins.
Okay.
The purpose of the offerings, if you look at all the offerings, the purpose of them is to point them to the fact that they couldn't get their sins forgiven without the Lamb, without Jesus having died. It was all symbolic. In the Old Testament, every one of the offerings pointed to Jesus. It did not point to the fact that they could do anything. And how do we know that their offerings did not take away sin?
He said they were covering.
It was a covering. That's the biggest part, is God said these are a covering for your sin, meaning that there's going to be something coming later that will take them away. But the other reason is they had to keep redoing them. Now, unless you're a Catholic, Jesus only died once on the cross. That sin, that atonement for sin, was not found in an offering. It was a covering for their sin that pointed them to the fact that there had to be a death, that there had to be someone that would die for their sins. Jesus. It was pointing to Jesus. Every single one of them was pointing to Jesus. Until the real Messiah would come. Now here's the interesting part, is the fact that had they accepted Jesus, had Jesus shown up on the earth and they went, this is the Messiah, you wouldn't have this in the millennium. When did God tell the Jews that they could stop doing sacrifices? Come on, this is an easy answer. He didn't. Now, let's go back, and as Charlene said, much like communion points to Jesus, these offerings point to Jesus. Now, the difference is, and one of the things you will not find, is that there is no communion in the millennium. Why?
We don't have to remember anymore. Because we're there.
Because Jesus said specifically, this do in remembrance of me. Until, and I think Paul even narrows down, says, till he returns, we're to do this. Guess who has returned in this time frame? Jesus. So why are they still doing sacrifices? Because they didn't accept Jesus until the millennium. So this is all still pointing to him. It's all still, because God never said, okay, you can stop now. He told the Jews way back in the time of Moses, this is what you are to do. He never said, do this until Jesus shows up. He never tells them to stop here. So why are there sacrifices? Because they're still, and this is the fun part for us because we don't get this, they are still under the Mosaic law. Because Jesus came not to abolish the law, but to do what? Fulfill it. So he did not abolish the law. That's why the Ten Commandments are still valid. Unless you're in any courthouse in the land, in which case they think that they can get rid of them. But the Ten Commandments are still valid. They're still 100% truthful for us. So the Jews, and why don't we partake in these sacrifices?
Because we believe in Jesus.
Because we're not here. Well, we're here, but we're not physical beings,
Right.
humans anymore. We've been raptured. We've got bodies like Jesus now. So we are in a different plane of understanding and existence than the Jews are here. And the Jews are still doing this. Why? Because the Jews going into the millennium are not raptured people. They're still under the Mosaic law. Even though Jesus has come and they've acknowledged who Jesus is, they're still under the Mosaic law. So therefore, to do what is right, they are still doing sacrifices. Does it make sense? You guys get it? Do you have questions? Let me ask that question.
But they are saved people.
They are saved people.
Because it's all saved, it's only saved people.
Yep.
Enter the land.
They are saved people.
But they're hanging on to their old sacrifices.
Because God never told them to stop. See, it's a really, it's hard to wrap your mind around some of this stuff sometimes. Because they're doing the sacrifices. Do they have any more meaning than they had in the Old Testament? Absolutely not. They have the same exact meaning. They're pointing to Jesus.
So they're basically just trying to be obedient yet?
Yep. Exactly.
Even though they do believe in Jesus.
Yep. God never says stop doing the sacrifices, so they continue to do them because they are
demonstrating their belief in the atonement
Yep.
of Jesus
Yep.
Christ for their souls.
Yep. Instead of demonstrating their belief that at some point there was going to be a covering for sin, now they're demonstrating their belief that there has been a covering for sin. And it's Jesus. He's sitting on the throne. There he is. He's pointing back to him now.
So they've already been atoned.
Yep. One verse here also talks about the fact that there are chambers for singers. They're going to have people there singing and praising, singing music in the temple. And the priests will still be doing their job in the temple. The sons of Zadok will still be doing their job in the temple. And if you don't know your history, which most people don't, Zadok was a high priest under David, and his family were the dominant family in the priesthood until the exile. They are the only legitimate line of the priesthood that is left after Eli's sons were killed and Eli's family was stopped. So therefore, it requires then that the Zadoks, that their family, which had been established by David and Solomon, that they continue to be part of this, which is why they are specifically mentioned here. Matter of fact, claims of being from the line of Zadok and his descent played a major part in conflicts over control of the priesthood during the Second Temple period from 516 to 70 AD.
Is there any significance that Ezekiel's temple was square?
Not really.
And well, we talked about the city's square.
Not a huge significance to it. Just happens to be the measurement.
Did you say sinners or singers?
Singers.
The chamber for singers. Okay.
Singers.
And
Yes,
first-
not a chamber for sinners, a chamber for singers.
Okay. That would be a big one.
We finish up in this chapter then with verse 47. It says, he measured the court a perfect square, 100 cubits long and 100 cubits wide, and the altar was in front of the temple. Then he brought me to the porch of the temple and measured each side pillar of the porch, 5 cubits on each side, and the width of the gate was 3 cubits on each side. The length of the porch was 20 cubits, and the width 11 cubits, and at the stairway by which it was ascended, there were columns belonging to the side pillars, 1 on each side. So now Ezekiel in these last couple of verses sees the temple itself, and he sees the vestibule. The vestibule is 10 steps above the inner courtyard. The Hebrew text actually lacks the number 10 and simply states there were stairs by which they would go up. The Septuagint added 10 and could very well mark a more accurate version of the Hebrew original. We don't know. The Hebrew words for 10 and the word which differ by only 1 letter. So instead of saying that there were steps which, it could very well have said there were 10 steps that they would go up. But in any case, it refers to the porch of the temple, the very front entryway of the temple. And it was very similar to that of Solomon's temple. So here he's referring to the entry room to get into the temple. And that's where we stop for today.
That's good, because my head hurts.
Now, do you have any other questions on this? Because I understand that this is complex. Okay, this is something that
One clarification.
Yep, go ahead.
Question maybe. At this time, while this temple was constructed and in use here, this during the millennium, at that time, where will as Christians, as raptured believers, where will our abode be? In the other temple that's not on earth and back and forth at this time, or where?
that's a good question.
That's a hard question.
Now, Scripture, Revelation tells us we accompany Jesus when he comes back to start the millennium.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we don't, and we're going to want our abode with him. Now, we're going to be given jobs. Right? Scripture makes it pretty clear. We're going to be here on the earth to reign with him and deal with things. So will we be in heaven, on the earth? The short answer is yes. We could be in both, because we'll be doing whatever he asks us to do.
Well, at the time of the millennium, the heavenly temple will be above earth.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be able to go back and forth depending on what our job is.
Right.
But that's why I just wondered,
Yeah.
Well, won't we also be observing this battle that they talked about beforehand?
Oh, yeah.
With the Jews that he has protected?
We're going to be sitting there watching him destroy
Right.
them. Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah. So, we'll be doing whatever Jesus asks us to do, and as such, then we'll be living wherever he wants us to live. I mean, our abode isn't necessarily
probably not Pennsylvania.
Probably not Pennsylvania. The neat thing to keep in mind here is that at that point, we have no need for a physical house anymore.
That's true. Well,
So,
no, we're going to have physical bodies though.
yeah, but does Jesus need a physical house?
I don't know.
Well, we're going to have our new bodies, right?
We're going to have our new bodies, yeah. We're going to have bodies just like Jesus has. So as such, if he doesn't need a physical house to live in, do we? Yeah,
Probably not.
probably not.
Will the people that aren't their body, the ones that come from the tribulation and are in the millennium, will they have new bodies too?
Nope.
Or not yet?
Nope. They don't get new bodies until after this is
So
all
they
said and
will
done.
need places to live and they'll
Yes.
need
There'll still be houses,
to
there'll
go
still
to
be
the
cities.
temple
Yep.
and all that stuff.
There'll still be nations, there will still be cities, places to live.
I noticed that the priests must like to eat a lot. They got 4 kitchens, one
Yep.
of each corner.
I'm sorry, Art, what did you say?
Said they like to eat a lot. They got 4 kitchens, one of each corner. Yeah.
All good questions, and I know this is a much more difficult thing than we like to try to think about. And it can get kind of dry with all the measurements. I hope I was able to bring some of it to life for you guys a little bit. Because it really is a neat section to look and see how the temple is going to be laid out for the Israelites. And keep in mind that the temple is for the Israelites. That's who it's for. It's not for the Gentiles, it's for the Israelites. And so God gives these measurements, these specifically for them. So it's really kind of cool when you get into it.
Is the outer court still for the Gentiles though?
Yeah, just like the old temple, the Gentiles could enter the outer court. Yeah. Yeah, they're still allowed to view what's going on, they just aren't allowed to partake. Because the offerings that are there, even though they're pointing to Jesus and Jesus is there, weren't set up to be done by them. Right? They were set to be done by the Israelites, by the Jews. All right, we are running late.
Will there be more than Jews coming into the millennium, right?
Yeah.
Not just Jews.
Yep, not just Jews, Jews and Gentiles. Anybody who believes. All right, let's close with a word of prayer. Lord, Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for the opportunity to look at this, Lord. And sometimes this can seem so dry, Lord, but yet you've got a purpose for it and you've got a meaning behind it. You are reminding your people who you are, Lord. You're reminding us who you are. And more importantly, Lord, you are staking a claim to this earth as being yours. Lord, we forget that. There's so many people that go around thinking that you are just not here anymore. And Lord, you own everything. You are God. You are sovereign. May we always remember that, Lord. May we never forget that you are God and we are not. Lord, as we go throughout the service ahead now, pray you just allow our hearts to be calm and stilled. May the music we hear, Lord, put us in the right frame of mind for the service ahead. May the things you've given Tim, Lord, just resonate with us. May you use him today to just have an effect on us. May we allow your Spirit to take the words and change us. And I praise you, Lord, and look forward to what you have for us. For your name, holy name we pray. Amen. All righty, everybody.